When I see you can breathe, you make me think what it would be like if I could still on the lips.
Well, good evening, Dr. Ruth Levine. How delightful this is. Welcome to the Evidence and Implementation Summit. For those of you that have just joined us to enjoy Ruth's keynote, I'm Robin Milden. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Evidence and Implementation, and my center is one of the co-hosts of this event. And this is Ruth. Ruth is the Chief Executive Officer of IDinsight. Ruth, I'm going to let you just talk a little bit about yourself for a second, if that would be okay, rather than me reading a bit of a stale bio and also what IDinsight's about. Then for the audience, Ruth has kindly pre-recorded your keynote, so we will move to that. And then audience, get ready because we will go to a Q&A right out of that. But Ruth, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, thanks very much. Nice to see you, Robin. I hope the connection is good. I live near Silicon Valley, and so our wireless is always quite bad.
That's very ironic.
I'm very, very pleased to be able to join, and I've been enjoying some of the earlier sessions and hope that I can contribute. So my own background is really very much as an advocate for the use of evidence for public policy making and for a whole range of different kinds of decisions. Throughout my career, I worked at the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. I was one of the early employees at the Center for Global Development, a US-based think tank that works on issues around, among other things, the use of evidence for decision-making by donors and other key actors in international development. I worked at the Hewlett Foundation, and at USAID, I helped establish the evaluation policy under the Obama administration for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Now, I am fortunate to, since June of 2020, be the CEO of IDinsight. And IDinsight is an organization established about 10 years ago to really raise the bar around the use of evidence and data for decision-making by both NGOs and governments in Asia and Africa. So that's a big remit. We are about, at this point, about 180 people strong. We're a nonprofit organization. And we very much orient all of our work to support monitoring, evaluation, research, and a whole range of different kinds of analytic work, very much tailored to the needs of decision makers. And so the kind of core of our work is that we start with the problems and questions that decision makers have, and we marshal a very wide range of data, evaluation, research, and broad analytic capabilities to answer questions and to support better decisions going forward. So that's my passion, and I'm working with a great team to pursue that goal.
Yes, CI, we're familiar with the IDinsight team, and you've, ever since one of your staff discovered this event, you've been great supporters of it. So we thank you. And Ruth, IDinsight and CI has so much in common. We must spend more time. But before we do that, if I can cue Ruth's keynote up, please, we'll enter into that. I think I'll hear it's about 18, 20 minutes, and then we'll come back together for some conversation.
It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to this audience because I know that this is a group of people who are incredibly committed and working so hard to bring the best of the evidence agenda to bear on some of the world's most important problems. As I sat down a few weeks ago to write this talk, I thought to myself, what's the sort of most important message that I can share? And I think it's this. We are warriors in a battle. And when I say we're in a battle, you might think, well, yeah, we're always in a battle with, funders with inflexible budgets and clients with unreasonable deadlines. We are kind of in a battle with the bias that gets introduced when people don't answer our phone calls, when we're doing a survey, or don't answer questions when we come to the door. And sometimes, maybe too often, we're in a battle with each other over what the best methods are. But the bigger fight is that we're all in is to elevate reason and facts over reflex and disinformation. And it's the central battle of this age. And there are a couple of ways in which I think it's the central battle of this age. So one is that, facts and the ethical application of scientific reasoning are really fundamental to solving some of the existential threats that we face, whether it's, pandemics or climate change or others that face us. Only through collective investment in science and a collective confidence in scientific findings are we going to meet the challenge of creating a habitable and joyful world for our children and for theirs. And that includes not just physical and biomedical sciences, but also the study of human societies. It is also the central battle of this age because democratic institutions can't thrive without the capacity of governments to respond to the needs of their citizens, of voters. And responding to those needs requires more than rhetoric about values. It takes generating and using evidence about the effectiveness of social and economic policies and programs, and smart, data-informed, day-to-day decision-making. We see time and again that the lack of confidence in the ability of government, of democratically elected governments, to deliver opens the space for dictatorship and even fascism. But maybe you're wondering, wait a minute, did I come to the right talk? What does this have to do with the title, the promise and pitfalls of co-creation? Well, stick with me. And without benefit of PowerPoint, I'm going to try to convince you that winning that war I just referenced requires evidence not only to be generated, but to be used. That use requires trust. That trust requires benevolence, and that benevolence requires, or at least is deeply facilitated by co-creation. So to win the war, we have to co-create evidence with those who must trust evidence to use it. Let's just get on the same page. Many of us are motivated by an unfailing belief that the work of governments and NGOs best serve people who live in conditions of vulnerability if data, the right kind of data and evidence are used for decision-making. And here's what I mean by the right kind of data and evidence, and it hopefully will sound familiar to you. It might sound like your day job. So that includes information that really represents the reality of life in disadvantaged and marginalized communities. It includes evidence that accurately captures the net impact of a program that's intended to preserve life and enhance livelihoods. It includes aggregated evidence about what works in distinct circumstances to improve efficiency with which precious tax dollars and other communal resources can be used. And it includes ongoing representative feedback from people who are involved in offering or receiving services to inform ongoing management and adaptations. So that's the kind of data and evidence, when it's used well, that is the lever that has the potential to lift investments that offer small or zero social returns to ones that propel social mobility, close social gaps, and much more. So in short, it's the fundamental instrument, or at least one fundamental instrument, that turns political rhetoric that wins votes into the allocation of resources and the design of public policies and programs that actually change lives for the better. It is the core of delivery. And if democratically elected governments are going to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of their citizens, they have to deliver. So this use of data and evidence is essential. And in theory, that's where we come in. Our work should be seen as a precious input to decision-making. But I don't know about you, but we often find ourselves kind of wringing our hands about how little our work is used in the evidence community broadly. And we huddle together and affirm our mutual importance in this community. We kind of vainly wish that people holding power as well as the powerless would see the wisdom of evidence-based actions. In the amount of ink that is now being spilled on why is evidence not used is really impressive. So I think we have to take the same analytical mindset and data-informed decision-making to kind of look introspectively to our own work. Why is this battle so hard to win? Well, to fulfill the potential of the use of data and evidence, we have to recognize that people use it when it's relevant to their lives, when it's in a form that can be understood, when it brings rewards or at least doesn't confer punishment, and when it is from a source they trust. I think it's this last aspect, whether data and evidence comes from a trusted source, that merits a lot more effort and attention than we've put into it so far as a community. And I think that's at least in part because we ourselves are kind of acculturated to kind of assume that we're trusted rather than to think that we have to work hard to earn it. There's, lots of ways to think about trust, but one that I've drawn on from the academic literature has kind of three elements: ability, integrity, and benevolence. To trust us, people have to believe that we know what we're doing, that we are being honest with them and, working with high integrity, and that we have their best interests at heart. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, okay, we've got this covered. As a community, as a set of professions, we're all about ability. We have advanced training and we train others for heaven's sakes. We are the ones who build capacity. We develop and document sophisticated methods and codify our standards and hierarchies of evidence, and we peer review. In fact, we spend the vast kind of majority of our time as a community of practice on establishing ability. We also have put a lot of energy into integrity. And think of the work on research transparency to squeeze out the space for conflicts of interest to bias our findings. We have codes of conduct, we censure miscreants, and we shun fraudsters. What we haven't spent enough time on, I think, is establishing that we have at heart the best interests of the people whose trust we are seeking. And the best way to do that is to involve them in true partnership. So whose trust are we seeking? That's not the easiest question to answer. In general, there are kind of two types of people who are notoriously hard to persuade away from pre-established beliefs. And those are the people we are trying to establish trust with: public officials and those people who are affected by public policies. We want to gain trust of public officials, including politicians, because it's often their decisions we want to inform most directly with the kinds of evidence that we are generating and translating. And a central way to demonstrate our trustworthiness to public officials who are making decisions is to understand and learn from their perspective. And this is something that, since I started at IDinsight last June, I've seen in practice day in and day out. So let me just share a little bit about that. What we do is we start all our work by trying to understand our clients' operating environment and the types of decisions that they face. We're sitting side by side in ministries and departments, trying to, extract as much meaning as possible from administrative data, improving the quality of that data when possible, and designing evaluations and other analytic work that fit tight budgets and timeframes, and also fit into the political space that's available. And it's from our clients that we learn about both informal and formal power and decision structures, internal organizational incentives, and the politically acceptable kind of solution space. And that working always explicitly in service of the needs of the client, that's how we orient our work. And that has other dimensions as well. For example, we have explicit agreements with our clients about what information we'll share publicly and what we won't share because it's being used only by the agencies. We work intentionally behind the scenes where we don't claim public credit unless it's acceptable to our clients. And those approaches we found to be really essential to establishing and maintaining those relationships of trust that are so essential for the virtuous cycle of data and evidence use over time. But then let's turn to the trickier question, the one that we ourselves don't have much experience with, of how to establish trustworthiness with the people who are affected by public policies and why that's important. And again, here I'm drawing from what others have done and the kind of inspiration that comes with it. I think it's a frontier area for us and for the broader community. There are a couple of reasons to focus on trust building with the public. First, because these are the people who should be represented, both democratically and statistically. We are working for them just as politicians and public officials are working for them, and it is their interests that matter most. Second, if our work isn't trusted by those who are holding politicians to account, if it's seen as kind of reinforcing and serving only the interests of the powerful, it's going to ultimately undermine rather than reinforce those democratic institutions. So, there's a more kind of positive way to think about this. If the work we do on data and evidence is seen as part of the way in which people have their voices heard and their experiences represented in an authentic way, this is going to contribute to pressure on politicians to use that input in their decisions and really strengthen that contract between citizens and their government. Okay, so now let's drill down on how we might increase the trust that people have in us, regular everyday people. And often people who may have a history, may have experience with systems that do not have their best interests at heart. Let me suggest that here we have to relax our kind of iron grip on expertise and lean into forms of co-creation that may be new to us. It sort of flies in the face of professional traditions that we've all internalized, but we won't be well served by thinking about expertise in exclusionary terms as something only held by people with certain degrees or certain kind of pedigree. Instead, we have to think about expertise as multifaceted and broadly owned. As evidence professionals, I think we can do this through deep engagement and appreciation for the knowledge brought by others, and we can leave behind our understanding of the world as being made up of those with expertise and those without. A frontier in this area has been called and conceptualized as research equity, which places communities that are being studied at the center. And because bias and expert-focused exclusivity often is manifested throughout the research life cycle, there's a lot of value in engaging communities, often via grassroots civil society organizations, in all of those stages, determining the priority questions, identifying the need for data, figuring out how to collect it, figuring out how to best report it and interpret what you find. At each stage, there's an opportunity to open things up by involving as full partners the people whose data is being captured and making sure that their needs and interests are driving the work. In concept, by reorienting data to the needs of the community, it becomes genuinely representative and empowering, and we live out this idea that we have the interests at heart of the people who we are studying. I've talked about a lot of things in a short time, so let me just recap a kind of simple or maybe simple-minded in a simple-minded way. If we believe that data and evidence are integral to saving lives, to expanding opportunities, to protecting our children's futures, we need to step up our game. We are not winning this war, even if occasionally we take pride in a successful experience. Stepping up our game is not about elevating ourselves, it's about elevating others to join us in formulating questions, in collecting data, in interpreting observations through multiple perspectives. The people who are going to use the information need to be involved in defining and collecting it. When we invite others into our work and when we behave respectfully and wholeheartedly as others invite us into their work and lives, we have the opportunity to build trust. And it's trust building that creates the conditions for data and evidence to be used to their fullest. Just to, in closing, I want to reiterate, this is very much an aspirational and learning agenda for me, not one in which I personally claim proficiency, and it is the frontier of the work, particularly this community-oriented work that we're doing at IDinsight. I think we've learned a lot through our work about how to build trust with public officials. We are learning from others about how to build trust more broadly with communities. I do encourage all of us, though, to think carefully, not only about how to create and maintain trust within our professional bubbles, but how to gain the trust of those that we serve. Thanks very much.
Terrific. Oh, they're speaking me saying I was going terrific. Excellent, Ruth. That was just wonderful. And you seem to have changed rooms because your background is now, unless you've put things up, but that was really, really as per usual.
My son moved out of the house.
Oh,
my son moved out of the house, so I'm now occupying his bedroom. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay, glad there's a. All right, I'm not going to ask. As those of us who have been following your work for a while have come to expect from you, that was very inspirational and humbling, and a terrific call for action to those of us that do the work that your group and my group do. I have so many questions, and I'm also going to field questions coming in here, and I'm going to theme some up. Ruth, the whole call for building trust, attending to power. So in the work we do, and there was a terrific pre-conference workshop that Alison Metz and I did on before the conference started about applying implementation, working with implementation teams in a collaborative way to sort of generate towards a joint outcome. And we spent a lot of time talking about power and unspoken power in rooms. But we also talked about that as an actual practice in and of itself, that we're not necessarily trained how to do, to work with people in a facilitated way where they do come to trust, particularly those that have no real reason to trust the system. We're often hired to work for. So if we're hired by governments to improve policy and working with the end users and, essentially clients of government, to your point, how do you establish trust with those that are affected by policies that aren't necessarily helping them? That, to me, reaching back to my background in psychology, how do we build a workforce, Ruth, across our different agencies to be able to do that properly? Where do we find groups? We're not trained to do that at university. We're not. Do you have some comments about that? Like, how do we turn that into action within our own agencies? What would it look like? What are your thoughts about building a workforce to do that?
Yeah, Robin, it's really a great question. And I only have kind of ideas and not a lot of evidence behind it. And as I said in the talk, really learning and being inspired by others. I think one central thing that we have to do is make sure that we are being highly inclusive in our recruitments so that we are recruiting from a broad set of different lived experiences and backgrounds. And that's, becoming kind of trite now and something that one has to say to, seem like you're being politically correct. But the fact is, it is not just, as they say, the right thing to do. It is essential for the work we're trying to do. And so, that is certainly a sort of critical step. And then I think finding ways to have immersive experiences for all team members. I know that for myself, the most kind of profoundly, not just inspiring, but informative experiences that I've had are the ones that are few and far between, but like the most immersive in communities that are disadvantaged, that are ignored by public policymakers. And even relatively brief immersive experiences are really deeply informative. And then the last thing I'll say, again, more as a learner than a practitioner, is the importance of engaging in partnerships with civil society organizations that are themselves deeply grounded in community, that have a lot of legitimacy. They might be member-based organizations or others that have, real connection and can, really be partners and peers in a way that I think can be very, so training teams, hiring people who really are excited about those kinds of partnerships and can pursue them. And again, I just keep emphasizing, this is not a specialty area of IDinsight. We are great, I think, at working in the policy community and with NGOs and NGO leaders. And we are learners in terms of being more embedded in community-based work.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's actually a question here, Ruth, directly relating to that from Samantha, thanking you and a terrific focus, and actually mentioning perhaps we also need to build trust with service providers, not just policymakers and the public, which goes to your point, doesn't it? Which I think is, again, a core theme of the work we all do. We need all, as we were saying yesterday, this is a team sport. And we need all actors in the system to be working together, which includes, the public and service delivery and policy. Do you want to add anything more to that comment?
No, I think it was a well taken comment.
Yeah. So how about this from Shefton? How do you manage the delivery of hard truths and keep trust in place? And it goes to Jenny's support group we're going to start after this conference around the people that need to deliver hard truths all the time. But do you have some thoughts around that, managing the delivery of hard truths and keeping trust in place?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not easy. I think for us, and in much of my work, not all of it, but much of my work before IDinsight was very much sort of within an ongoing relationship. So it wasn't sort of a one-off, we sometimes, but rarely do just kind of one-off evaluations, but rather where you might, get negative findings back, but instead do evaluation and help do the organization we're working with, trying to figure out how those things. I just need to do a technology check. Can you see and hear me? Because I look like I'm frozen.
Yeah, you might need to go 3 sentences back, Ruth, or maybe 2 minutes back. And now we have a nice picture of you.
Okay.
There we go.
All right.
Maybe
let's see.
there you're back. Start that again. You went to that jittery.
Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Yeah, much better.
Yeah. Sorry. Gosh. Yeah. So what I was saying, but like wave your hand if the technology.
Don't you worry. I'll throw something at the screen. Okay? Yep.
Yeah. Okay. What I was saying is that the work we do, and that I've tried to do throughout my career is always within the context of a longer term relationship. So you're not just kind of dipping in to do an evaluation, you hand off, perhaps disappointing news, and then you move on. No, you work with the organization to take on board perhaps negative findings and figure out, well, what to do next about it. And as I said in the talk, in IDinsight, we always have agreements with our clients about what information will be made public. So that helps protect a little bit against the negative ramifications or the fear that might come. So I think that is, part of the way to mitigate the breakdown in trust that might come when you're delivering harsh news.
Yeah. And again, that we can get a global support group going for that because it is a tricky part of our work. Ruth, are you familiar with Hilary Cottam's work, if I'm saying that right? Cottams? So
No.
Jo here has posted, she's hoping that you are familiar with Hilary's work. Maybe somebody can post something on Twitter for us. From Radical Help, which demonstrates life-changing outcomes by working in partnership with those we serve. So maybe we can do a little shout out to people on Twitter to post some of that work, and we can take that as homework. Thank you, Jo. Terrific question. Let me throw something else towards you. So this is a bit of a long paragraph from Norma. Thank you. Sometimes we can better help marginalized groups, not by continually studying them, but by studying the systems and policies that marginalize them. By studying policymakers and those in power also requires gaining their trust. But studying policymakers and those in power also requires gaining their trust. How do we engage them in research when the findings might expose inequitable dynamics of policymaking that marginalize others? I think, again, Ruth, that's similar to what you've been speaking to date. Do you have more to add on that related to that question?
If I understood the spirit of it, I think the only other kind of additional point I'd make is that, I believe very much in kind of standpoint theory where you stand really permits you to see different parts of a power structure, and that those who are, for whom systems are failing, those who are the most, have had power stripped away from them the most, are often the most able to identify what the kind of scaffolding is of power structures, and they can be, very informative. So I think that people who are in elite positions find it quite difficult to see all the ways in which privilege is manifested, all the ways in which behaviors might affect, often inadvertently, other people, but the people who are affected feel it and they see it and they can talk about it. So I guess that's the only other thing I would add is I don't personally have experience kind of studying policymakers from that perspective, but I think that there's a lot of knowledge held by people for whom the system is failing. And I'm frozen again.
Well, I can
How about if I turn
you.
off my video? Do you think that would help?
I think yes.
Okay, can I just turn off my video?
Yep, big smile. I'll
I know.
stare at that smile there.
Let's see if that works better.
Yeah, you're definitely coming through stronger. It's sort of ironic that you're in Silicon Valley. I don't know if
tell me
anyone wants
about
to
it.
hashtag somebody on Google to do with the quality of Ruth's internet at home and get her some help. Maybe someone get in touch with Elon Musk. I hear my 16-year-old son tells me he's inventing some satellite internet thing that we should all be signing up to. Don't promote that on Twitter. I don't want to. All right, Chloe has, I'm going to just switch gears a little bit, Ruth. Chloe has a question here, again, thanking you for a terrific talk. There's a sentence and then a question related to the use of randomized controlled trials, which, Ruth, just for some background, at our event every 2 years, The comments around RCTs can become quite polarizing. And I'll just say one statement for those of you out there. Randomized controlled trials are a method used in evaluation to answer a question. It's just one type of method. There are lots of types. But let me read Chloe's question and see what you think, Ruth. Thank you for a great talk. In your experience, do you find that there is tension between when they vote for it, it moves. Do you find that there is tension between delivering what is considered best practice or robust research and building trust of the public? If so, how do you defend using research approaches that may not be perceived as best practice, e.g. randomized controlled trials, or published in reputable papers? And Chloe's recently joined CEI. I will welcome Chloe, and has come from another organisation we're all familiar with that does carry out enormous amount of randomised controlled trials. So I'm sure this is from her personal experience. Do you have some comments there?
Maybe. So I'm not 100% sure I understood the question. Robin, do you want to rephrase it? Or do you want me to make some guesses?
Let me rephrase. So I think part of this is, let me go to the second part of the question. I think it's easier. So how do we defend? So the assumption there is that we need to defend using particular approaches in research or evaluation, which may not be perceived as best practices, in quotes. For example, randomized controlled trials. Reading between the lines, I think what Chloe's asking here is, when a randomized controlled trial is a method for testing the effectiveness of something, is what the researchers are proposing, and it's not seen as best practice, or people are opposed to it, which they can be for a number of reasons. I think Chloe is asking, how can that be defended? And she may be insinuating, apologies, Chloe, if I'm getting this wrong, she may be insinuating that the use of RCTs doesn't build trust in the research community.
Right. Well, I don't know if there have been other sessions on RCTs, the pluses, the minuses, the debates, and so forth. So but those can be easily found pretty much anywhere. So we won't have to rehearse all of them. And I'm sure that's not what she was asking for. I guess my view is that what we have to do is always start with the question that the group we're working with is asking. And then from that, work backward to the best, most feasible, most robust possible method. And in some cases, not most cases, but in some cases, that will be doing an experiment of some kind. Using randomized methods, in some cases. And, I think that there are experiences where the use of randomization to allocate resources from, say, a new program has been seen as a trusted way to do things, because it's fairer than having, say, the minister deposit the new program onto his home district. And instead you allocate it randomly, and along the way you learn. So there's a lot of art in the communication around these things. I don't think it's a given that randomization is or must be seen as something that is unfair, that deprives people unfairly, or that is experimenting in a nefarious way. I do think that we have some history to reckon with, and particularly, I think broadly, the research community has to reckon with this kind of practice of studying others, extracting information, not sharing it back, and often being more in service of kind of general knowledge gathering than actually responding to the needs of communities. So I don't have a magic answer to this, but I do think that if I am finding that framework about, do we know what we're doing? Are we honest? And are we acting in the best interest? Do we have the best interests of the community at heart? I think that that is a pretty powerful three-part formula. And that over anchoring to the, do we know what we're doing, and are we using something that others in our profession will perceive as excellent research? I think when we overweight that, we're in trouble. So that was a long, winding response to that. Good question.
Yeah, I think also fundamentally what you've provided in your talk is if trust is built and real collaboration is happening, I think various evaluation methods that people may have misunderstood or felt uneasy of, that can be overcome. So I think that is part of, again, your call to action on trust and building our credibility in areas and being legitimate and showing integrity. I think then the kind of nuts and bolts of what methods we use to answer questions would be easier to develop together, I suspect.
Yeah,
Rather than
and
so
I do think that
polarizing.
it's essential. Yeah, I do think it's essential to really focus on what is the core question that is meaningful to the people you're working with to answer.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
And then work backward to the method.
Yeah. I tell you what, this question of trust is like highly popular on these questions. I'm trying to curate them, and I can see Alison Metz is joining us, who I mentioned before ran the pre-conference workshop on Power and Trust and Implementation team. So she's got a cracker of a question. I will go to one before that from Tamara, who's been waiting patiently in line. Ruth, they're voting for questions, which is quite fun, so they keep moving up and down. This is changing tack slightly, and then I'll come back to the trust point. What advice do you have for policymakers, so this is less about sort of the research community, who are tempted to fall into the expert trap? In trying to gain public trust and build public policy, we can be tempted to think that things in terms of us versus them, we can be tempted to think about things in terms of us versus them when we are all affected by public policy, even policymakers themselves. Do you have a comment for Tamara on that?
Yeah, again, I'm not 100% sure I understand the spirit of the question. I think that there are a number of, kind of tactics then that are quite effective in gaining community input and thereby building trust. So, authentic advisory boards are increasingly, in the health sector, as you well know, they're increasingly patient groups that are invited into pretty consequential decisions, and increasingly even to decisions about, doing peer review on academic papers, having patients and patient groups actually doing peer review on papers that correspond to their own illness or condition. And this is, I think, a really, really excellent, you get information from that, but you also signal that you have respect and appreciation for the knowledge that is held outside of, say, a narrow policy or expert community. And so I think like the more you can do that, the more chance we all have to build the connections that are going to serve us in the long run. I also think just one more thing on the policy side is that I know from my own background that it can be very seductive, very, very tempting to focus on, getting a policy approved, getting a new law, or getting a new, promise from a politician. And then you sort of like lose your interest a little bit. We collectively lose our interest around that all important implementation, enforcement, execution part of things. And finding ways to build in continuous feedback, both quantitative through monitoring systems and qualitative through systematic outreach to the affected communities, I think can also contribute to trust over time, so that there's not as great a kind of disconnect between the lofty we're going to educate every child to a high standard, and what is really going on as those laws and regulations are implemented and as the resources are allocated.
Yes, unfortunately for groups like us, implementation is not often seen as the glamorous part of the work. The page, the bit that's taken for, we've got the idea, we've got the evidence, we've conducted the evaluation, we now know some things. And then, as I said yesterday a few times, and then the Gantt charts come out. And we have a lot of work to help people understand. Knowing if something works or not, or how to improve it is one thing. Knowing how to get that into policy and practice in a sustained way and improved on over time is an absolute different activity, and often different sets of questions and different sets of skills and needs different teams. So it's not the glamour bit sometimes, even though we're trying our best to make it glamorous. I'm thanking people. There's a lot of people commenting on the curtains behind me, apparently, the blue velvet curtains, which is hilarious. No, I did not put curtains up in my house. And you know who asked that? I'm in a studio. Alison is getting some action on her question. So we're going back to the trust point. That's obviously resonated with a lot of people, Ruth, in your talk, looking at the activity. So Alison is saying, thanks so much for this talk. You have mentioned ways to build trust. Can you comment on how you know if trust has been built? What signposts do you look for that demonstrate trust has been built? Are these signposts different for policymakers, service providers, or community members? And you can tell this is someone who thinks deeply about this.
Great question. I would love to turn that back to a larger group, because I think we all have, from our personal and professional experience, a lot to offer to that, to answer that. I guess I would say that a core signal that you're building trust is that that more and more information is shared with you. So, I'm much more familiar with, sort of being in the, a policy context than working in, say, a community-based organization. And in a policy context, there's always like the official rules, and sort of what the bureaucrats will say, this is how we do things. These are our 3 goals. This is how decisions are made. So there's the kind of on paper way things are done. And often when you're building relationships for the first, week or two, or the first period, that's what you'll hear back, is that's how things are done. And then as you build trust, people will share with you really the real story, sort of what's actually happening in a given agency or department, who's really making the decisions, who is, socially connected to whom, how did so-and-so get their job. And while that is not necessarily relevant to, a question at hand, I think I'm just trying to give an example of, that kind of signal of like, oh, I'm now learning something that is not just the kind of boilerplate on paper description. So I suspect that is, that's one thing that I have observed over the years. What about you, Robin? You probably have an answer to this one.
Oh, gosh. I mean, I can't provide evidence for what I'm about to say, which is ironic given our jobs. But my experience of it is when the conversations that you're having, this is particularly with policymakers and service providers, are more honest. There's a level sometimes even of confidentiality that's respected on each side. It goes to your point, Ruth, of our CEI also does some work where, it is up to the people that we are working with as to whether things are released. Now, in the evaluation and evidence community, that can be controversial because that's, the whole open source science and sharing findings will accelerate, and avoid wasting time. However, when you are asked to put some structures in place. For instance, if you're working with policymakers and, government, in most countries we work in have a particular way of, doing governance and setting up committees and line management. And when they trust you enough to take on the idea of trying a different way of working that they have not ever done before, particularly at a senior level, and participating in that and showing up to that and trusting a facilitative process, which sometimes means, hey, we're not going to fall back into that old type of practice. Remember, we're trying a new way of working together in teams. That would be my experience, as people sort of commit to showing up to things and behaving in a different way, in a collective way, particularly when there are sort of known structures that tend to drive their behaviour. And sometimes just people coming back for more, asking more questions, valuing, particularly as an evidence and implementation person, evidence can be seen as something of the other, and people are superstitious of it, which rightly so. The research community hasn't been terrific in sharing and building on research in a collaborative way at times. But maybe we can start a international collaboration on how do we know when trust is built and we're making an impact sustainably.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you have an example here, but Neha is asking, would love to hear Ruth give us a quick example of your work or maybe your team's work when trust was broken and you have to rebuild it.
Ooh, that's an interesting.
This is where you need your staff, Ruth, to be texting. Remember that project we did? And
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure there are examples. Give me a moment to think. Gosh.
Neha, you've given a curly
I don't
question.
know any. Yeah, I honestly don't know an example. I'm relatively recently at IDinsight, so I don't know any examples off the top of my head from there. Well, oh gosh, it's kind of a long example, but when I was so I'll try to be very, very brief, but when I was at USAID, I was an appointee in the Obama administration, as I mentioned, and one of the tasks that fell to my office was doing an evaluation of the response to the Haiti earthquake. And I don't know how many people remember that terrible, terrible event, but the US marshaled resources from literally across the government to respond to that earthquake. And there were successes and failures, many positive results that otherwise wouldn't have happened, and then some real disappointments. And in the course of kind of commissioning and overseeing that evaluation, there were many times when I would say there was a risk of trust breaking down because negative findings were, kind of showing up, and some agencies were looking better than others and worse than others. And so anticipating that trust was going to break down, because in a government, there's lots and lots of internal jealousies, even within the same administration. And so for one agency, USAID, to be doing an evaluation that was, essentially making a judgment about the quality of the response by other agencies and departments. It was I did not even understand how precarious a situation that was politically. But it was clear that trust was very fragile in that environment. And I will say that I think the only thing, you only do things one way, but I think the only thing that kind of saved the day there was an incredible amount of personal outreach, talking, personal trust building at quite high levels, rather than just throwing papers back and forth, being defensive about methods. It was a very I don't know what to say. It was very dependent on human connection. I guess that's what
Yeah.
I'll say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I imagine there are enormous amount of people on this feed right now who have experienced that. I know for my team at CEI, we've been in that situation several times, conducting evaluations where it's a bit tricky.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what I have started to tell young people who've asked me for, career advice. And, I think the one thing that the
Don't
things
do
that we
it,
carry.
is what you say.
Yeah.
Go into, don't do it.
No.
I'm kidding.
I think generically the things that we carry with us throughout our careers are our reputations and our relationships. And man, tend them both very, very carefully. And, don't burn on the relationship side, don't burn bridges. Don't lose track of people you have strong connections with, because they will reappear in your lives. And, if they're on the other side of a negotiating table, it is incredibly helpful to have that prior relationship. So now I've gotten well off track, but reputation and relationships, very important.
No, that's terrific. That's terrific. I think that I can't get to all of the questions here, and the technicians here are strict on the clock, but you have more questions, and I want to say a special hi to Maureen Dobbins, who's online. She's one of my favorite academics up in Canada, did some work around knowledge translation. She's written a really long question. Maureen, you could just send that straight to Ruth. I'm sure you and her would. Ruth, you can. I'm just getting a cue here from my studio buddy. You can answer them later online if you like. There's quite a few there, Ruth, if you jump on. John, Deborah, sorry I couldn't get to you. Joe's posted the website to the book that she mentioned, Radical Help. Jillian, Erica, right, it's terrific. So maybe Ruth, if you get a second, you can jump online and answer them, and if not, Ruth is extremely accessible and can't actually ever leave her house anyway. So what else are you doing than answering EIS Summit participants?
I'm on Twitter and the DMs are open. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ruth, for agreeing to give a keynote at this conference. I so wish it was in person. This is less than satisfactory, but better than nothing for now. I hope you're staying safe up there. And really, really appreciate you sharing your thoughts, and even being a little bit, the candor at which you speak is always very welcome.
Thank
to everybody
you.
else,
a real pleasure, and sorry about the technology debacle.
Let's just, somebody's would have emailed someone in Silicon Valley by now, surely. Go back to your timelines, everybody, and select where you want to go to next. See you in the next session. Thank you.